There are many strong voices supporting Ukraine and many Ukrainians that are active in supporting and promoting its cause throughout the West. Few are more vocal and effective than Yana Rudenko, and few followed with more enthusiasm and affection. She has a strong voice on platforms like LinkedIn, and despite being repeatedly banned, she bounces back to fight the good fight. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available on popular podcasting platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help brilliant new speakers that we feature on the channel. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider supporting us by becoming a patron. Now, Yana, I've been reading your posts on LinkedIn for really the entirety of the war since you started posting. And it's a huge, huge privilege to be able to speak to you today.
Thank you very much for having me today. And I'm very honored and also privileged to be able to write, and also people who are interested in my content that I'm sharing. And I'm really I'm very grateful for them to be interested in such topic.
Now, you have a really strong following on LinkedIn, and I know how incredibly tough it is to actually build an audience and to get engagement. And for those who aren't familiar with your material, we will, of course, post a link so they can find it. But you create text-based material, you do sort of video blogs. Could you describe to me how your activism began and how your technique has evolved over the months to build the incredibly loyal and fanatical audience that you now have?
Thank you for this question. I will already say that I will be honest and I will be direct. And of course, this topic, I will be very personal, with personal content, personal moments. Just before our conversation, I had my session with a therapist, like a psychological therapist, and I have it each 1 week or each every week, because for me, as a person who saw war crimes, who was under the war and under the Russian occupation, for me it's extremely hard, and you just need to cope and work on it. And we just discussed today that she knows about my activism, and she said that it was correct way that I started my activism not immediately, but I gave myself some time to recover after, because I was under the Russian occupation in February and March 2022, but actively, socially, I became very active only in August when I came to the Netherlands. So I was also these weeks, those months, I was also very active, but not in such a structured way, not with direct message or a concrete message. So it was more chaotic, but I think that I started my LinkedIn profile, working on it and being very active only in August, because I needed those months to recover, because I wasn't able. And just imagine how many voices of Ukrainians are now muted because they are not able to speak. Even they have a story to share, but they are not able to speak because some people are now under the occupation. Some people just was liberated, or if a war crime happened to them, like as looting or rape, or someone from their family were killed, they are not speaking, and because they are not able physically to speak. And I know this moment. So for me, when I'm speaking, for me, it's not only about myself. It's about a lot of people that are not able to speak, and I'm not talking about even those who were killed.
And I spoke some months ago to a lady called Oksana Semenyuk, who is an art historian. And, like your story, she survived in a basement for many weeks in Bucha. And we know that in Bucha and Irpin, terrible crimes were committed. And I think she was describing to me this terrible sense. It's a kind of survivor's guilt to an extent, but, her basement survived despite the terrible hardship, but almost everybody in a neighboring apartment block did not survive in that basement. And of course, then there's the terrible story of the famous Ukrainian artist who was already quite elderly, but actually starved to death in her apartment as a result of Russian actions. And I think we forget sometimes that, you know, these are, and you are an individual person, and you have to deal with experiences which no one expected to have to deal with in the 21st century, and then emerge from that being sort of, you know, functional, etc. That's a huge amount of pressure.
Yes, thank you for recognizing it, because it's really, you need to continue working. Like I have to work because I need to pay for my I need to pay for my apartment, and no one gives me money, so of course I need to work. Then I'm studying on my master program, and I have this social activism offline and online, so it's also very different. And still that I need to have some rest, some personal life, and yeah, it's hard, but we are driven, we have a mission.
It also makes me wonder as well. I mean, a lot of individuals, of course, are going through terrible physical trauma and mental trauma, but at the same time, the war is still on. So to an extent, you know, those who are on the front, those who are abroad, those who are living in Ukrainian cities, either closer or further away, do you think there's an extent people are suppressing you know, the worst aspects of the mental impact at the moment, because there's still a need to survive, there's still a need to, you know, shore up the economy, get the armaments in, train, learn, fight back. Do you think there's going to be some kind of outpouring of very traumatic and difficult to deal with emotions when Ukraine is victorious?
Definitely. Definitely, because, you know, and I'm not sure that I know it how it's called in English, but in Ukraine it is like post-trauma. So it's definitely in a moment, like especially when I was in Bucha, you know, I saw like war crimes, but in a moment you don't feel it. You just you are in a mode to survive, and your most important mission and goal is like you need to survive, so you do everything to survive. And now all Ukrainians, maybe they are not thinking about like survival for your own, but survival as a whole, and we are all engaged. Like I think only about victory of Ukraine, that like Ukrainians are safe, and we are doing all of this. So you are in still in like this survival mode, that you are like working to survive. And of course you don't have time to think about like, you know, what's going on. But especially I know it well, because I'm Ukrainian who was under the Russian occupation. Then I was living in Kiev when Kiev was shelled, like when Ukraine was shelled. I was in Ukraine, and then I'm a refugee in Europe. So I'm in these 3 months, and I can promise you that it is very different experience, and each experience is hard in its own way. Like of course that under the occupation is the most hardest, but all other also very like challenging. And it will appear like trauma will appear later, because now I am talking to all my friends every day. I have friends who is fighting now. In a moment you are like, you know, you live life, you still smile, sometimes you still have like, you know, dogs, some pets on the front line, and you know they take care of them. They continue like living, they are dancing like Ukrainians, and will sing and dance all the time. It doesn't matter what will happen, but only after we will need to work a lot. And it's a challenge for our intellectuals, for our authors, poets, you know, somehow to artists, somehow to phrase it, to put it into the way that it will become easier for people to heal their pain, and to show it.
Absolutely. And almost everyone I've spoken to seems to be dealing with the pain by being purposeful, whether it's contributing to civil society, whether their activities are journalistic, or they're writers, historians doing lectures, etc., or like yourself, you know, a prominent activist. It's pouring yourself into physical work, an activity which has meaning and value, certainly in victory. And some of those activities will have value even after victory to strengthen civil society and fight corruption. But it's not to play down that, you know, when the camera's switched off, when you've done a piece of work and you stop to think. I think everyone feels the exhaustion, everyone feels the trauma and the extreme unreality of what's happening. And also it can, I'm sure, be very pessimistic, because the realization that the Russia of the 90s, which people had some hopes for, is completely gone. And what we see now is a Russia that fits the mold of Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Stalin. We see a colonizing, imperial, aggressive Russia, which harks back to many centuries ago. And there's a realization that that is not going to go away. You know, we're not going to get the slightly softer, chaotic version of Russia we saw in the 90s. We have a Russia that is embittered, traumatized, envious, loathsome, and yet, you know, has the money and had the money and the material to actually act on its perverted ambitions.
I can only add that when I look at events before, what was happening, all of this, I can say that Russia was never, like, for me, Russian 90s are not better than what is happening now, because especially when I face injustice, when I faced the war, I cannot be indifferent to others' pain, or to others' injustice, to others' wars. And always when I think about the war in Ukraine, Russian aggression against Ukrainians, I remember two Chechen wars. Wars against Ichkeria, and when Chechens population is just, it's a very little nation, it's just a few millions, but they were fighting because they wanted to be free, they wanted to be independent, they want to be democratic. And Russians invaded them in 1994, if I'm correct. And on New Year's, it was New Year, people were going to celebrate New Year, and then Russians invaded them. And the war lasted for 1 year, and there was horrible war crimes. There is one documentary, I will share the link. Unfortunately, it's like half in Ukrainian, half in English, or in Russian, but I think that it's most important just to see what is there. And I watched this documentary only like 6 months ago, like a few, and scenery, what was there, and the description of war crimes is just the same that is happening now. 1994 and 2022, the same war crimes, the same scenery. So nothing was changed. Like, it wasn't good. Like, for me, it wasn't good, because then just before 60s, Ukraine, during Soviet Union, all intelligentsia, intellectuals were killed in Ukraine, were executed by Soviet Union. And then, like, few years later, again, and Chechens, and then Georgia, Crimea, like all of this. So it's happening all the time. So it's, for me, there is no this distinction of like some good years. And also about Chechens. For me, when I was watching that movie, for me it was so impressive to see, to hear what Chechen generals were telling. They were like, there was, they were telling stuff that me, as a 24-year-old Ukrainian, I can say the same stuff about Russians, like specifically the same. And like, compare Chechen 50-year-old general and then 24-year-old Ukrainian, like 20 years later. I can say the same stuff about Russians. They committed the same, so it wasn't changed. And the first Chechen war was without Putin, so it's not about Putin.
That's right. And there's, I don't know if it's part of that documentary, but I've mentioned it in interviews last week. There's a clip of an interview with Dzhokhar Dudayev, who's one of the Chechen generals, or the leader, in fact, who was assassinated just weeks later by the Russians. Not only did he foresee that Chechnya would fall and that it would become a sort of warlord governed vassal of Russia? He also predicted that Ukraine would be the target. And as you say, his predictions and comments on Russian imperialism are incredible. But what also brings that to mind is that at the time, Russian foreign propaganda was incredibly effective at labeling the Chechens as terrorists. The fact that they were non-white, the fact they were Muslim, the fact that we knew nothing about them locally meant that Russian propaganda was extremely effective. We saw the same thing in Syria, where Russia was supposedly, fighting ISIS and bringing its own version of order. But also we see the same war crimes on a vast scale, the bombing of civilians, the erasing of cities to their very foundations, block by block, the bombing of hospitals. It's taken a long time for the West to stop projecting its optimistic assessments, its false readings onto Russia. And in fact, I can say absolutely that has not completely stopped either, because we're now projecting our own fallacies and false hopes onto the Russian liberal opposition. So I'd love to know your sort of thoughts about that.
Yes. I will try to speak very carefully because, of course, I can be a bit emotional in the. I will start that. I will immediately first say that there are. I understand. I'm aware that there are some Russians who contribute to victory of Ukraine, who support Ukrainians, and I saw. But I met only few. Like, although that I'm having very huge networking online and offline, and I'm abroad, I see not that many people, but I see a few Russians who contribute to the victory and who support Ukraine. Although that the majority whom I met, and they are Russians abroad in the US, in Europe, they are not supportive. And from their comments, I can see that they are not really, they can tease me, like they were teasing me for my Ukrainian flag, for something else. Whether it says about their support or they are against of the war, I'm not sure. So, but I'm aware that there is some percentage, although that we must admit, it's very little percentage of people who are against of the war. And for me, it's like there should be actions in such times as this tragedy, like there are Russian aggression against Ukrainians. There must be actions. I won't trust a person if it just talks. I need to see actions. I just simply don't trust them. Speaking about Russian liberals and Russian opposition, the most famous Russian oppositioner for Europeans, for Americans, it's Navalny. Unfortunately, as a person who knows Russian, who was reading maybe a bit more, I know that he is not that good as he seems to be. Because he was joining many rallies, which are very right-wing Nazi rallies. It's called like something with march. I don't remember specifically the name. And he was joining those rallies. It was in 2012, in 2014, like so, not that a long time ago. He was joining them, and they were waving Russian imperialistic flag. And then another important comment about Navalny, that he was saying that, like about Crimea. Crimea is not a sandwich to give it back and forth. Whether he is a friend for Ukrainians? No, definitely no. Even like for us, Russian opposition can be for Russia without Putin. But Russia without Putin, it doesn't mean that it is not imperialistic Russia. It doesn't mean that it's fully democratic. And when we talk about Russian opposition, we need to think what this opposition is, because I'm a person who talked a bit, not fully, a bit with Circassians, with Chechens, and they are getting discriminated, and they don't like and they don't prefer Russian opposition or Russian liberals, because Russian liberals don't support indigenous people of Russia. So whether it makes Russian liberals good or bad, or like for us more preferable, they are not Putin, but whether they are better, I'm not sure about that. And definitely that Navalny is not a friend for Ukraine, with all his what he was doing and saying in his actions. I know that there were a few. There is one prominent Russian journalist. She was saying very correct stuff. She called Russia a fascist country like 10 years ago. She said it herself. And she's killed. She's not alive. And I'm sure that any opposition that is now like, you know, talking, and if they are talking for a very long time, I think it's like comfortable of opposition. So it just made to be visible. My concern that there is no protest in Russia. I see a lot of nations protesting. I see Iranians. Whether for Iranians it's safer to protest than for Russians, it's not safer. Like, it is not safer. Like, it's even like, I can say that it's even more dangerous for Iranians to protest, to rally, than for Russians. So for me, this topic of security, that it's not safe, it's not really the topic, because give me at least one uprising, give me at least one example of one protest or uprising or something when it was fully without violence. No, it's like you are changing the regime, you are making it more democratic, but you are doing it like you need to change it. So it's always with uprising, it's always with some it's not safe. But like, if you stand with the idea, it is not safe, but it's your way for democracy. You need to liberate yourself. No one can liberate them. And so for me, when I think about Russian rallies, they are not safer, they are not more dangerous than rallies in Iran. And opposite, it's more, if they rally a bit, the whole world will see. But if Iranians rally, people, the world doesn't look to Iranians that much as they look at Russians. So it's very Russia-centric.
Of course, you do get Iranians abroad with very vocal protests. You get Syrians abroad with very vocal protests. As you say, they're not covered that much on the press. There's a sort of institutional bias, obviously, against certain parts of the world that are less familiar to a Western audience. And if there were Russian-led protests, they would get a huge billing. And this, for me, is the biggest disappointment. It's the lack of activism. It's the lack of organized activism. Now, again, it has to be said, I've been on lots and lots of marches, and there have been individual Russians there. They will hold Ukrainian flags, and in effect, they become Russians that are supportive of Ukrainian victory, but I suspect they lack an idea of what victory would mean within a Russian context, in a democratic Russia. So they lack organization. And that is extremely worrying, isn't it? Because Navalny is in prison. There are other leaders as well, like Karamurza and Ilya Yashin. There are some strong, more democratic voices, I would say, than Navalny even, but they're either in prison or abroad or silenced. There seems to be very little in the way of organization, very little in the way of effective activism. And this is where Ukrainians provide a strong contrast. There are so many events in London and around Europe being run by Ukrainians, Many of them are women. We'll come to that in a minute as to why, women are playing such an extraordinary role in this Ukrainian sort of political renaissance. But there are events, there are conferences, there are lectures, there are constant examining of the narratives of history, mythologies, literature, and trying to reinterpret what that might mean in today's context. All that seems to be absent, apart from a few prominent historians, a few, as you say, interesting voices on the Russian side. But in scale, it just lacks the scale of what we see in Ukrainian cultural and civil society.
I would like to say that as a Ukrainian, I want to see Russia democratic, independent, and because at least they are my neighbors. For me, it is very beneficial if they are democratic and they don't want to invade us. However, we see it in very systematic way. It is very systematic way towards Ukrainians and their neighbors. Only 30 years ago, we were under the Russian occupation, under Soviet Union. Only 30 years ago, during these 30 years, there was already 6 invasions of other countries. So it's a very systematic way. For me, the problem lies in another a bit angle, that we had Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was defeated, and they admitted there was prosecution. They admitted to be that it's their fault, it's their responsibility, and then it was changed. Russians, they were never defeated, they were never prosecuted, and they were never held accountable or responsible for their crimes. And Russians have no less war crimes than Nazi Germany, especially during Soviet Union. There were 3 Holodomors in Ukraine, 7 million of Ukrainians, up to 7 million of Ukrainians died during Holodomor. Executed intellectuals, just suppressing all uprisings and etc. So there were a lot of crimes against their own these nations under in occupation. And Russians, it's very systematic way to discriminate others, because I have a friend of mine. She's here in The Hague. We work together a lot, and she's 18-year-old Ukrainian. But it happened that she was living in Russia with her parents, and she told me that from her childhood, all these years that she was living there, she was discriminated by Russians in Moscow, white Russians, and she is white. It cannot be a race, but just, oh, you are Ukrainian, Hohlushka, Hoholka, and all of this. And it's just in a way of communicating. For them, it's fine that all are nations close to them, neighbors are they are higher than all others. They are better. They are, although there is nothing better than, I cannot say anything that they are better in. So for me, it's a very systematic way, and for me, it's also the way that Russians were always under one leader. So they got used to have a leader who will lead them, and it was never really democratic. And we call I'm sorry for saying it, but in Ukraine we call Russian slave. They are slaves. Their mentality, it's just mentality of slaves. Whether it was safe for Ukrainians to upraise in 2013 during the Euromaidan, or which was later called Revolution of Dignity, no, it wasn't safe. We were we were already going to dictatorship. We were there, and I remember that night very precisely, because I was having my one competition, and then after that competition I talked with my friend, and then next day I woke up very early, and I was texting with friends, and they told me that we got beaten on just Maidan Nezalezhnosti in city center of the capital. Students like who were 17-year-old, they got beaten. But Ukrainians, what was the reaction of the society? We won't let our children be beaten. You are like, because the power is in the hands of the nation, not in the hands of the leader. So for us it was very unsafe. It was like we were dying. There were people wounded and killed in Maidan Nezalezhnosti, in the capital of in the center of the capital of Ukraine. People were killed. For us it wasn't more safe, or like so, because now a Russian says, oh, it's so unsafe for us. Whether you do it or not, it's in your hands.
And of course, the outcome of that revolution was not assured. It was not guaranteed. People went out there not knowing whether they would be victorious or not. And we now know, of course, in Belarus that people also took to the streets en masse. And that wasn't successful. So, we have to look at these events, look at the bravery of people that actually do this, and not through this sort of rose-tinted kind of hindsight that people fall into. And there are other characteristics that I think are quite interesting, aren't they? And Belarus has a dictatorship imposed upon it. Without Putin and without the support of Russia, Lukashenko would have no chance of controlling that country. And to an extent, Belarusians, I feel, would never have attacked their neighbor unless they were a puppet of Russia. What's the difference? I'm still struggling to understand, why one succeeded and the other didn't, because it was 50-50. There was a chance of an autocratic slide in Ukraine. We know that the operation to take Crimea was being planned while, the Kremlin's puppet leader was still in charge of the country, Yanukovych.
I think that it's a very philosophical question, and it's very interesting question to research, to think why some nations did it, why some nations could become more democratic through protest, and why Ukrainians did it and Belarusians couldn't. Although that I remember those period very, very well. I was living in Kiev already, and we were coming to Belarusian embassy. We were supporting them. I know I was sharing a lot of information about that support Belarus, because I was having already international friends. And for me, it is as for a human being and for Ukrainian, for me it is precisely very sad and very painful that Belarusians wasn't able to finish, were not able to finish it, because at least as a person who was under the Russian occupation in Bucha, I am the direct victim of that they didn't manage, because if they managed, then Russians wouldn't attack us from Belarusian side. We were talking, I remember a few posts on social media about it, and I think that that Ukrainians have this very long history of fighting for independence. We were fighting for independence when there was a Cossack state. It was 17th century. We were fighting against, and we were trying to get our liberation in 18th century, in 19th century. So we have this, if you look at the history, we have these centuries of fighting for independence, and against Polish or against Russians, or against Mongols. And it seems that it's very long, it's I'm 24 years old, I haven't seen any of those, but it is really in our let's say blood. Well, let's say that it's in our poems. It's when I read Ukrainian poetry, I see this, that you need to be united and fight against, because so it's built us. So it's built us, even that we were suppressed very hard, with huge violence. We were suppressed for centuries. Each generation was suppressed. We managed to fight in 2014. We managed to stand, and in 2014 and in 2013, I'm sure that there was no democratic leaders who will lead us. No, people just students themselves, they just like, oh, let's go to stand for, because Yanukovych refused to sign like this document, and Ukrainians just, oh, let's go. Students said, let's go and stand because we want to be in Europe. We want to be democratic. We want to live this life freely. And they got beaten. And Ukrainians, without a leader, like, we don't need a leader, but we went to fight for our children. So it is the difference, maybe in like in this background, that we were fighting for independence for centuries, and we couldn't get it. I don't know the history of Belarus as well, but I just know, and I remember there was some point that they don't have that long history of fighting for independence. So maybe they just not that, as a nation, they're not that mature yet to get it, to fight for it. But of course that we are very open to, like, I have Belarusian friends, and we stand with them, we support them, but for example, in my student association, I said that on individual level, Belarusians are welcomed in our student associations, but as a country, they won't be represented. Belarusian flag and Russian flag cannot stand next to Ukrainian flag. Politically, is not correct, and anywhere else, like in any events, cultural, sport, anywhere, it cannot be.
Exactly right. You know, it was the equivalent of trying to get Nazis and Jews to sit down, in public forums in 1942. It's just not something anyone should be doing, and they should have the cultural sensitivity to understand how painful that is. Now, talking of this sort of call it this activism, or the unwillingness to take rules from others or kowtow to authority, some of the Ukrainians I've spoken to have even called it ingrained stubbornness, which, in a positive way. Those qualities seem to be present in you, because you've been active on LinkedIn, and I don't know how many times you've been banned, but you're banned over and over and over for posts which are simply telling the truth, and not in a graphic way. You are simply pointing out the facts of what's going on. So could you describe a bit the sort of lack of support you get from the tech social media platforms, and how you persevere in bouncing back despite being banned? How many times is it?
So as of today, I was banned 5 times. As people say, after the 3rd time, people are not getting back. I'm banned 5. It is kind of a magic. I can say, first of all, that each time that I'm banned, something very unusual happened. Some severe, very brutal violence happened. Each time, like, I don't remember, of course, the first time, but I can have a look. But last time that I was banned, it was so brutal and painful, and harsh war crimes committed by Russians. And of course that I'm telling the truth. It is my mission to tell the truth. It is my mission to, I'm not calling for violence. Like, there is a difference that social media are not ready yet for, and we are not build it very well. We didn't design it yet. That I'm telling people, I'm letting people know that violence happened, and it's very different from calling for violence. And people, social media doesn't see the difference. They don't see it, and they don't recognize this difference. Although that I said that it happened in Ukraine by Russians, and it is a fact. but they don't see it, and they say that, oh, like, you cannot call them Russians, but who did it? Like, Russians did it. Like, and they social media just doesn't want me to call Russians. Like, what should I tell? Who did it? Who, like, not Russians, but who? In social media doesn't want me to call them that Russians committed it. Another side that last time that I was banned, it was horrible. Video was released when a Ukrainian prisoner of the war was beheaded, and of course that you are speechless. Like, it's you are simply speechless, and there is I don't know, I can't say anything about that. Another time that I was banned, it was when Uman and Kherson were shelled. Also, like, shopping mall was shelled. Children died just in a shopping mall, and I'm banned after that. Whether I'm doing something in the wrong way, or it is that social media are biased. I see the difference towards myself, because first, usually they have this operation that you need to you are getting banned, then you appeal, and then you wait 1-2 weeks, they connect you, then they tell you why you are banned. Like, they don't tell why you are banned, but they show you your social media posts that they went out against professional rules, and usually I disagree, of course, but you should promise that you will not break rules. So each time I promise, I keep I try my best not to break rules. But you know how you can follow rules if the rules are biased? So how you can follow it? And last two ban, one time the third time I was banned for 6 weeks. So it's very hard. Like, just imagine what is happening for one day. Imagine the volume of events that are happening during 6 weeks. And I wasn't speaking online. So that was the way when I started my offline activism. And then last 2 times that I was banned, I see the difference towards of LinkedIn towards me, because they are getting banned me very quickly, but then they very quickly they are getting me back, because I receive a lot of complaints from Russian bots and trolls, so I'm getting deleted. But then there should be a human being who checked my content, whether it's correct one or like normal or not, and I'm getting back with my content. So my content after when a human being checked it, it was fine, it was normal, but just that I got deleted, and it's very in very wrong way. But they started doing it, still deleting me. It's very, for me, it's like each time I'm having a heart attack. After my 6 weeks ban, and during those 6 weeks ban, I talked with an American team. They changed me to an American team, and I talked with them, and then I talked with a European Senate, and then again with the American team. So it was like they know me well now. So I'm sure that there is one LinkedIn professional who checks my content. Yeah, but.
And that's it. LinkedIn, yeah, it seems to be more of a bureaucratic problem there. And the way you describe it, it sounds quite confusing. And they're probably quite confused behind the scenes about how to deal with Russian trolls and bots. Twitter is a very different case, however, isn't it? Because in the recent hack of Yandex, and also there was a leak of the Twitter algorithms. And certainly there seems to have been a conscious effort in Twitter to downplay anyone talking about the war, anyone putting forward a Ukrainian point of view. The NAFO network, NAFO network. So I'll be picked up on my pronunciation of that by people if I get that wrong. That also has been muted deliberately. So that's not just a sort of institutional bias. That's a very specific bias against the Ukraine point of view and those who are supporting it. That is extremely concerning, isn't it?
It is very dangerous. It's very dangerous not only for Ukrainians but for free speech of Europeans. And I think that Europeans, Westerners, should be the first one who should be very concerned about the topic why Ukrainians are getting banned. So it's not only about Ukrainians, but it's about your freedom as well. And I have very good example about Twitter. When I was banned the first time, I remember that I saw a post of someone that Medvedev was writing about that, like, Ukraine shouldn't exist, this country doesn't exist, and all of this horrible propagandistic stuff, and which was also violent. And the post, Elon Musk refused to delete that tweet. But then there was a screenshot of a Ukrainian woman writing about Russians, also in a bit violent way. I agree that it was a bit violent, but it's the same level as Medvedev, or even like a bit slighter, because she is just a simple person. But that guy is like with a huge following, and he is a politician. And Elon Musk, like Twitter, deleted her post and banned her, but they didn't ban Medvedev. And as I know from last news, that now either all profiles or some, Twitter deleted this, that it is like a Russian government profile, but it should be written there. Like, people should be aware that it's Russian media, that it's Russian governmental profile. And I think that they changed something there. Unfortunately, it's like, it's very dangerous because as a friend of mine said, like Marijn Marcus, he's a data scientist, and he's also very active on LinkedIn, that 90% of the war is information. 90%. It's about what messages you send, what do you know about the war, what do you know about the past, because the war, Russian aggression against Ukraine, the war didn't start in 2022. It didn't start in 2014, and in 1991. There is a long history, and to understand the context, you need to look at the history. But for us to show the history, we need to speak, and we shouldn't be muted, but we are getting muted all the time.
Absolutely. And I mean, the last area I wanted to focus on really leads on from that, and it's traditional media. And I would have liked to think that traditional media would have a bit more depth and a bit more nuance behind it, perhaps, than social media. But nonetheless, we still see war fatigue. We see a lack of stories about Ukraine in the mainstream media. They report the high-profile events. Of course, they report the drone attack on the Kremlin. And there still seems to be a very strong Moscow Kremlin-centered bias, as you said, an editorial bias in choosing stories from that point of view. Whenever I go to events in London and they come to the Q&A, whether it's sort of reporters or academics or the public, almost all the questions are led by, what does this mean for Russia? Or it's like, blah, 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 Russia, and then, Ukraine as a footnote, rather than, the opposite way around. And if, like me, you don't watch that much of the mainstream media because it's not very informative, but when you do dive into it, you find that there's all sorts of ignorance, bias, both unconscious and maybe even conscious sometimes, that again presents things from an entirely, I would say, either Moscow-centric bias, or is just sort of ludicrously superficial, or even overly optimistic, especially when it's talking about, resistance in Russia, or people who are being drafted, who are against the war. I mean, there's all sorts of sloppy language and sloppy thinking. Do you find that as well in European media that you look at?
I see it everywhere. I see it in each level. Starting from social media, finishing with traditional media, and also when I talk one-to-one to people, because I talk a lot with Western Europeans, I talk a lot with Americans, And I see this optimism, but there is no reason for optimism, to be honest. I don't see any sign for you to be optimistic about democracy in Russia. Like, I don't see those optimistic signs, because I talk with Cherkessians, and I talked with one girl on Twitter, and she told me that I will not reveal my name, I will not reveal my appearance, and she refused to speak with me like on a call, because she said that 2 of her relatives are right now in prison, captured. There is no sign of democracy in Russia, because for me, democracy towards Russians in Moscow, like those, like, you know, white, like, I will say white. I'm also white, but like those Russians who are like in Moscow and they are rich and they don't suffer. For them there is a democracy because they are rich, they are Russians, everything fine with them. But what about Chechens? What about Dagestan? What about Cherkessians? If they will live democratically, for me, it will mean that Russia is democratic. But now there is no democracy, and there is no sign for democracy in Russia, because so it is that. And about traditional media and about it's very Russia-centric. It's very about Russians and what Russians do and what Russians think, and I don't know why it is like that in minds of Westerners, because maybe because Ukraine started to be very active in communication only like recent years. But before, we were never active, like we were never targeting you, we were never sharing with you about us. But Russian propaganda has been working for centuries. For centuries, they are donating money, they are showing that they are rich, they have great culture, we have great sportsmen, we are awesome, and it has been happening for centuries. Although that about culture, half of their culture is stolen from other nations, so it's maybe even more. And when unfortunately I become very upset, it literally, you know, when like I'm talking a lot and I'm spending a lot of my time, efforts, and for me it's painful because every day I have to speak about Bucha, every day. To be honest, like for me, maybe it's harder to be in Europe because now I need to speak about Bucha every day, but maybe in Ukraine I wouldn't need to speak about it. And when I speak about it, a lot of people ask me, oh, what do you think about, what is your, like they hear it, they hear my story, and their first question will be, oh, what do you think about Russians? What is your attitude to Russians? And I'm a bit shocked, like you just heard me being under the Russian occupation and I saw war crimes. But your question will be not about how are you, how is your family, how you're coping with it. Maybe you need help, do you need anything? But first question will be, but what is your attitude to Russians? Do you think that all Russians are responsible for the war? And it happened to be not one time, unfortunately. And so that is another challenge. And for me, it is a personal challenge that I cannot get, like, you know, into discussion. I cannot say that, oh, like, what are you talking about? And, you know, become angry. I really need to cope with myself emotionally and try to educate and tell people why it is a wrong way, why it cannot be like that, why it cannot be Russia-centric. And as I said earlier, Russian centricity is in academia, is in media, it is in business, is on individual level. So
well, we'll end on a more positive question because we'll talk about Ukraine, and I think it's appropriate to end it on Ukraine and not talking about the aggressor. But one thing I wanted to point out that occurs to me, which what you just said, Russian propaganda is extremely expert at weaponizing its victimhood or its perceived victimhood. This is the same psychological propagandistic trick we saw with the Nazi regime. You know, they're being aggressive, but they blame somebody else for that aggression. We're only defending ourselves, blah, blah, blah. I mean, Russians, again, have done this for decades, is poor little Russia, look at us, always invaded, all this, oh, etc. And it's extremely effective. And that is one of the last mythologies that I think needs to be tackled, because it is an imperialistic, aggressive colonial technique, which we really need to kind of weed out of the Western narrative and coverage of Russia. Yes, many people suffered in the Second World War, and in fact, the majority of the suffering and destruction took place on the territory of Ukraine and Belarus, not Russia itself. But let's not mention the word Russia again for the last few minutes of the interview. Let's turn to the health of democracy in Ukraine. And are there reasons to feel far more optimistic about the evolution of civil society, democratic institutions for the entirety of Ukraine when it's liberated?
It is an amazing question. And I must say that I'm so proud and I'm so glad how Ukrainians reacted to the Russian aggression, because first, before in January, in February, people were speaking and people were like a bit depressed, and of course it is very depressing news, like that you will be attacked. But once we got attacked, 100% of Ukrainians said we will win. There was no another choice, like we will win because we won't let someone else to rule us. We won't let someone else to be that, to behave like that. You are not allowed to behave in such a brutal way. And it's mainly about civil society, because civil society started, for example, like in my experience, it was 7 a.m. and I was texting to all my friends. So like wrote in all social media that we got attacked. What we need donations, we need people to talk about it. And it started from the first day. And like we were all active. And Elon Musk says that, oh, there is so many Ukrainian trolls. But to be honest and to be like, it's sad, but when your ship is sinking, you are calling SOS. Like, it's what you do. You are screaming, help us. Like, so all these Ukrainian trolls, they are really real people who are sitting right now in the basement. I was the one who was sitting under the basement, and I was in a chat with girls writing about on social media, on media, contacting global media, international media, to write about Ukraine. And I was in the basement. But of course, like in a day, I lost all electricity. There was no chance to help me. But for me to help, I need to help myself. But how we started it from the first second, that you need to be active on social media. And it's also a lot about your talents. Some people will be active on social media as I am. Some people will go to volunteering because they are better with like these shipments, with logistics. They know what to buy. They are more into like this stuff. Some people will go to fight. Like how many Ukrainians went to fight immediately? First 3 days, there was lines, there was thousands of men standing, and no one pushed them to fight. They all stand themselves. They got their own, like if you own a gun, they took it and they were fighting. They went to the army to defend their own country. Then how many? Another topic it is about our volunteers. I'm so proud to be like a Ukrainian because of our Ukrainian volunteers themselves. They said, okay, we are collecting money. We need to buy for this brigade. We need to buy a drone. We are collecting all like for a drone. And for this brigade, we need to buy a car. So we are buying a car. And it's like, about the level of unity and about the level of trust. Ukrainians trust themselves, like each other a lot, because of course, I'm young. I don't have that much money, but I remember that I spent like immediately the whole salary just to all these fundraising campaigns for cars, for shipments, for drones, for etc. Because you trust, because you know that you see that this person is a sister of that, like she has a brother who fights in that brigade. So you really trust the person, because a person will want to save her brother, she will make everything to save her brother. Or you see that it is a wife of someone, or it's her father is fighting, or you see that they are in that community, and you will do it, and you trust, and you how we were so active, and everyone was engaged into victory of Ukraine, and are engaged because either they were protecting their own city, or women were cooking, or we were making this protection stuff, and all of this were happening, and each person found something to do. There is no single person who did nothing, except me. I was in the occupation. I was doing. I was surviving. But everyone was engaged, and it was for a very long time. Of course, that after a few weeks, after a few months, people had to start working. So if you are doing nothing, you are working for the victory. If you are working, then you are working and you are donating your money, it's a part of your salary to campaigns. And for me, it's very important now to explain why Ukrainians donate money, because for other people it may seem that Western countries donate a lot to Ukraine, give a lot of shipments, they give a lot of this. So why Ukrainians are donating money? Why you are doing all of this fundraising? That's why of the reasons why Revolution of Dignity was successful. We don't rely only on our government. We do our stuff themselves. Each of us want to be engaged, each of us doing something for the victory. That's why also that, for example, government is bureaucracy, mainly it's more bureaucratic way. So soldiers need drone, but to wait it from the government, it can be a few weeks. But when Ukrainians can just in a day, we donate money, we buy it, and we send it, and so it will save the lives of our defenders already in a week. Or also it's important that, for example, governments, they talk about huge shipments like tanks, some other cars, some missiles, protection equipments, and they talk less about little shipments like drones, thermal imaging scopes, or these helmets. So these smaller needs, we do it ourselves a lot. And also it's not talking about that we need to help elderlies, or we need to help animals and protect animals, or we do something for children. And there is so many needs and different needs, and you just engaged into one of these, what is the most important for you, and you help, and you collect money. So it's very important, and it's everything. It's about civil society, and we now train and we build civil society during the wartime. But now we know, and we are so aware that we pay such a huge price for our freedom and for our democracy, that we won't let anyone to take our democracy from us.
I think that's the inspiring part of it, is just seeing how many people are active in such a variety of different ways. And not every single initiative works. Not every single initiative is like a blockbuster, but it's that continuous pressure from hundreds of thousands of people sort of expanding freedom like a gas. And to end, I think, on this thought, what we see in terms of how Ukraine has emerged from being a sort of Homo Sovieticus, from a vassal of the USSR, to become a country with strong identity. And now that identity is being projected around the world, I think the next step actually is for Europe and the democracies of the world to actually learn from Ukraine, to renew their own concepts of democracy, which have come under attack and have actually been weakened over the last couple of decades. People have taken freedom for granted. They've taken wealth for granted. They've taken lack of corruption for granted. And I think, a realization of what Russia is, and a realization that you can actually break out of that and embark on a process of change and renewal through civic society institutions. I think that's a lesson we're going to have to learn to save and evolve our own democratic institutions as well.
I totally agree with you. One of my main messages was that don't take democracy for granted, especially if you have been living in a democracy for a long time. You got used to it, and it's nice. I'm very happy for people to live in democracy, but we really always need to remember that it can be different. So, and for me, not taking democracy for granted, it's about that you need to protect it, and you need to always work in it, and you should always have a strong civil society that will protect, that will watch will watch the government, will watch others whether it works well, because it seems that it's hard to break, but to be honest, it's not that hard to break, and you need to always work on it. So don't take democracy for granted. And also that I heard a lot about that some countries were invited into United or European Union easier, so they're not still that democratic. And for me, for Ukrainian, I'm aware that my country, my government is not like the most, maybe not the most democratic. We have a lot to work on, especially in the terms of rule of law and courts and justice. But now we, as a civil society, particularly, we grow so much that we know where to look at and how to look at our government, and we know how to check it, and we demand a lot. We demand more because we are working on our democracy so much that we have the right to demand.
And it's remarkable to see that progress. And, I hope that it continues in future years. I hope it carries on accelerating through and after the war. And, well, I wanted to say thank you so much. I know some of the topics we touched on are tough ones, and we have to recognize what individuals such as you have been through. But I'm hugely grateful to you for appearing on the channel. It's been a massive pleasure getting to speak to you. And I advise everybody to follow your incredibly strong voice on LinkedIn when you're not banned. And if you are banned, everybody needs to pile in and complain to get you back on as quickly as possible.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. It is the most precious for me.
Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!